Dress matters. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati, lecturer, commentator, author, civil rights worker, Black history historian. Part 2, 400 years since slavery. Where are we now?
As to the place of black people who were enslaved before America became state, an independent state from Britain. Many of us know that, the United States gained its freedom from Britain. It became an independent nation from Britain. It was a movement for independence from Britain. A genuine revolution is what happened in France. A genuine revolution is what happened in the rare in human history is what happened in Russia. A genuine revolution is what happened in China. A genuine revolution is what happened in Cuba. It's a revolution changes the system completely. It replaces the old system with a new system completely. The French Revolution taught us that, the difference between France and the other countries. They don't have any legacy of monarchy and so forth. Why? Because they chopped their heads off. Simple as that. You don't have any lords and dukes and duchesses and so forth in France. For all the ill things you can say about Napoleon, he's a bad man, but he got rid of the monarchy completely. England and Sweden and other places have not. They have kings and queens and so forth. Ceremonial though they are, they still cling to the ideas about the monarchy. The French did it because it was a complete change in history. And Napoleon did something else. He changed the way people thought about history and change. Up until the French Revolution, a revolution meant getting back to the way it was. It was counterclockwise. That's why people wanted us to God save the Queen or the King or whoever. Not get rid of the King and Queen, save them. People were structured to love those rulers of that day. So when you have a complete change clockwise and you change the complete system, you have a revolution. And they are rare in human history. They don't happen very often. Somebody's planning a revolution right now, I'm going to add to this, although we're getting a whole debate, but I'm going to mention that the only other great example of a revolution happened in Haiti. Haiti was a complete revolution. The slaves overthrew the system and established a new order of land distribution, sharing the wealth with the populace and so forth. Yeah, Haiti, this little island that we know nothing about except it's a basket case. It's, disease, disaster, and death, and that kind of thing. It was not always that way. It was the richest colony in this hemisphere when the black people, through the French, the British, and the Spanish, off of that island and took control. So it's one of the few examples set by Africans, enslaved Africans, overthrew their masters. It's never happened before in recent. That was a revolution. Obviously, the counter-revolution suppressed it to what it is now. The United States, all of Western Europe conspired against Haiti to create the mess that we have now. It wouldn't recognize Haiti as a free country. The United States until way after the revolution in 1865 or something like that, you know. But what I'm trying to point out about America, this is a myth, see? The American Revolution. There was warfare, and they did get independence from Britain, but they did not change the system. In fact, slavery got worse than it was under the British. That's when all of these draconian laws, you know, Fugitive Slave Act and crazy stuff of people not being able to learn how to read and write. Under the British, it wasn't that bad. They introduced slavery, introduced racism. It wasn't brought here by Americans. It was brought here by the British. But that's something that the American people inherited, is a white supremacy arrogance from Great Britain. You remember Great Britain? It was so great that, get this little damp island, no bigger than the state of Minnesota, once claimed over 25% of the world's land and said it was so vast that the sun couldn't find the British Empire, that the sun couldn't cover it. It was so vast. Now we know that the sun can't find the British Empire, but it used to be so. That it was, you know, this little powerful island, well organized, you know, pounced on an unsuspecting world and introduced a language. It's the most widespread language in the world. There are more Spanish speakers than there are English speakers, but English speakers, you can't go anywhere on this earth where people don't speak some form of English, some patois, something that is derived from Shakespeare's language. That's powerful, awesome, because people think and see through language. That's how you interpret life. I think the Native Americans have the best definition of what language is. And I say Native Americans because I want to say it's one of the nations of northeastern part of the United States, and it probably is. One of the Iroquois out of that confederation who said that language is life. Think about that. That's in fact what language is. You can't have life without language. You can't see, think without language, and to some extent feel without language. And the English language is the most widespread language on earth to this day. It replaced French as the diplomatic language of the world. So all of this, you know, I said, well, this guy is talking about too many things. No, I am not. That's what's wrong with us. You know, I'm not talking about too many things. That's what life is, complexity. It's not simplicity and sincerity. It's more than that. And this is why we can't solve what we call the race problem, which is not, has nothing to do with black people. They didn't invent the term race. They didn't structure the laws. There's no law that we associated with race ever written by any African or black people in this modern world. All the laws were written by people who define themselves as white. All race laws, racist institutions, structures were invented by modern Europeans. You know, Europe is a land, and the people call themselves white eventually, not always. There used to be Irish and Scots and Welsh and Anglos and Saxons and Picts and Normans, and that's who they were. You back up a few centuries, nobody was calling themselves white. They call themselves by their language and their location and geography. That's what made an Irishman an Irishman, was land and language, you know. He spoke not English, but his own language. You know, this is more akin to Scots than it is to English. So the I'm just trying to fill up some blanks, man. There are blanks that need to be filled, so I'm sorry. That's why I talk this way. You know, American people have got to be, well, I put it in the words of James Baldwin, if you think that I hold all that cotton in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi simply because I loved you, then you've done something terrible to yourself. You're surely mad if you think that simply about history. He went further to say, I'm still shocked by the fact that most white Americans sincerely believe that the country was settled by Gary Cooper or John Wayne. And as far as I can tell, they still elect their political leaders based on how closely they resemble Gary Cooper or John Wayne. If the American school curriculum could be changed tomorrow and the real role of the American black man could be revealed, you would find that you'd not only be liberating the minds of black Americans who know nothing about their history, but you would also be liberating the minds of white Americans who know nothing about their history either. If you're compelled to lie about any aspect of anybody's history, you're therefore compelled to lie about it all. And this means that if I'm not what I've been told I am, then you're not what you've been told you are either. That's the question that Jimmy Baldwin raises, that we're dealing with. Some people in America are growing up, and it's signified by this article that I mentioned. It's more than an article. I mean, it's like a curriculum that the New York Times released a few weeks ago and stirred up the pot of thinking and raising contradictions and trying to understand American past around slavery, which is a visceral part of the making of what we call the United States of America. Even if George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were here today, in fact, you might have an argument with them. You know, that America was a white affair. You know, that's the myth that's been handed people through textbooks, tons of movies and so on. It has ever occurred to you that something like, let's just say the Civil War and the interpretation of the history of the South. There must have been 2,000 or 3,000 movies made by the Hollywood contribution to white supremacy on the Civil War. I mean, I don't think we can count the movies that are made by the Civil War until there's one great exception about, and I'm talking about full-length feature pop culture kind of movies. I'm not talking about documentaries, the kind of movies that most people are most likely to see. The Civil War movies, almost every one of them, save one, have been all white affairs. John Wayne must have made half dozen of them, John Wayne or somebody like that. You know, you think about that. You know, well, I think about it if you don't. The first full-length movie, popular movie ever made on the Civil War, where black people were involved in it, was a movie called Denzel Washington. Help me, audience.
Glory.
It's called Glory. That's the name. Well, that is the first movie ever made concerning black people's contribution to the winning of the Civil War. They were on the side of the North. They were used as eventually a military advantage to the North because that's what they represented. And you forget that the North was somewhat losing until black people entered the Civil War about almost 2 years later after it started. And it changed course. And the South, the North won the war because of the entrance of black troops in the war. Said Abraham Lincoln, had it not been for the colored troops, we would not been able to put down this rebellion. This is quotes. It changed course. Black people had a lot to do with the North winning the war. There were over 200,000 black people, one of whom was one of my great-grandfathers. In one of those 447 battles, they won 22 Congressional Medals of Honor, and the first time it was offered, black people won 22. Some people say, well, I was then and there. No, it isn't. It's important right now for black and white children to know that. Not because it's race or whatever, because it's true. You know, the greatest piece of folklore in my family on my father's side is about old Willis, you know, who was a metal worker who joined the Union Army and fought to help free his people. That's something that's real, folks. You can that's a fact of history. It's recorded over and over again by the general, but it's not in textbooks. It's not in popular Hollywood movies. It's not in the messages and images and symbols that we get every day about the American past. The Civil War was a war between two white guys, you know, who fell out over something. Certainly wasn't slavery. It was something else. I don't know what it was. But you want to acknowledge that the war was over slavery. That's a fact. There were 4 million people held in bondage, right? For 4 bloody years, the bloodiest war in the history of the world up until that time, recorded history. And in 1865, April 7th, there were 4 million people coming out of bondage. And before that date, they were enslaved by the United States government, not just Thomas Jefferson, although he might as well have been the government, because they ran the government. But this is an institutional crime against the people. It's not individual, it's not Jack Dunn. The white man today who says, well, I wasn't there, I don't know anything about that, and you don't know what you're talking about. How can you not have anything to do with it? You're an American, you inherited whatever there was. You inherit the 4th of July, right? We celebrate that in a splendid ways. You know, it was a part of history. You weren't there. Why do you celebrate the 4th of July? Because it's a part of your history. How do you do that? Can you cafeteria shop about what is history and what's not? I don't think you can. In order to understand that, history, whatever it is, you have to include the good, the bad, and the uglies so you can understand all of it and synthesize it into something, a lesson that we all can learn from and be a better country. But until you and me and others accept the past, William Faulkner again, great writer, he said it best. He's a man I wouldn't like, you know, but it wouldn't be simply because he's white. It's because he's what he thinks of me as some sort of superior pet, in his own words. You know, I wouldn't like him, you know, but it wouldn't be because he's white. That's something else. But you superimpose race over everything now to make it think it's black and white. I think some things are wrong and some things are right, no matter who's doing the right or wrong. Some things are right. So you say, well, regarding this period of history, this very short period of human history, the 400 and 500 years or so, I happen to think the people who enslave other people are wrong in the mind. That right now. Now you say, well, back in the day, they didn't. It's not back in the day. We know better than back in the day. So what are we going to do about it? That is the question confronting America now. Is its history. Are you willing to look at it, examine it, try to understand it, learn from it, transcend it by learning, what was good and what was bad, and not all was good and not all was bad? There are no people like that on earth. There are no people had something like, the founding fathers, what we've made of them, the icons. We're idol worshipers. That's what it amounts to. And nobody had any faults. And let's examine this. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison and the old man Benjamin Franklin and who did I leave out? Hamilton, and he was in George Washington's army, and all these people whose names we know, they're, who the founding of Americans. You won't allow them to be human beings. Why is that? Is something we're afraid of? Thomas Jefferson, who wrote those magnificent words in the Declaration of Independence, was a hypocrite. See, hindsight makes you wise, I guess. What else do you call that when people had to have to claim one thing and do the very opposite? That's what you call hypocrisy. He declared the rights of man, of women, not women, but back then you didn't consider women. See, what do you do about that? All men, and we might think the extension is to women. It might have been, not necessarily to say it, you mean women, well, maybe not, But not only that, all men is, you left out a lot, because all men are not black. Are white, there are black and other colors. So they're not all white. All men are not Gentiles, and some of them are Jews. All men are not Protestants. Some of them are Catholics, and so forth. That is a lot needs to be added to that, and this is what we're trying to do now in the process of trying to create democracy, to make it inclusive, which Jefferson didn't. And it's people say, well, he lived in his time and context, and this is the way people thought, and so forth. That's true. Everybody, he thought that way. But Tom Paine didn't think that way, who inspired Jefferson and Washington and the rest of them, and his magnificent little booklets, Common Sense. He was a revolutionary. He was against slavery. That's why you don't hear about him. He's buried somewhere in upstate New York with the grass growing over his grave. But he was a hero at one time, inspiring the founding fathers. Tom Paine. What happened to Tom Paine? Who made the great speech, who inspired George Washington and others. So there were other men who didn't think like Thomas Jefferson and the rest of the founding fathers. There were other men with ideas that opposed theirs. There were religious people like the Quakers who opposed the Baptists and Catholics and Methodists and so forth about the question of slavery. The Quakers are among the most morally brave people in the history of America, because they stood up when the odds with the most powerful people were for the institution of slavery, and they claimed to the world, we are not having it. That's what. Not in our community. I can't tell you what to do, Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, but our kind of Christianity says we cannot enslave people. And they got rid of enslavement in their community, thanks to people like Benjamin Lay, Anthony Dinazay, and so forth. They got rid of slavery. They wrote the first protest against the founding fathers, against the document called the Constitution, was written by Quakers. Yeah, incidentally, Benjamin Franklin really wasn't a Quaker. Okay. He owned a few slaves as personal service himself before he became kind of converted. Now, you hearing me, those of you, black and white, are bristling, mad as hell, because I'm messing with the myth that America is. I want to overthrow the myth and replace it with complex reality, where it's not simply
The myth.
black and white. Is this and not that. It's got to be this or that. It is not true. That is not the way life is. It's not either or. It's both and. It's some of this and some of that, a little bit of some of the other, and so forth. That's what makes human beings so complex. We're not amoeba, one-cell animal. We're complex, complicated, live contradictory lives. And we can fashion ideals and try to aspire to them. Ideals of what ought to be. Something like white supremacy racism is what is. The ideal is that is a democracy which does not exist, never has. Even the Greeks who conceived of the idea.
Plato believed that concepts had a universal form, an ideal form which leads to his idealistic philosophy. Aristotle believed that universal forms were not necessarily attached to each object or concept, and that each instance of an object or a concept had to be analyzed on its own.
Plato and Aristotle and those guys were not commoners who didn't have the same rights that they had. They might have lived in a democracy. The mass of people in the Greek society, there were not a lot of Greeks in the world at that time. The mass of them were what we would call today enslaved because they didn't have freedom. And I don't go into the argument over the degrees of slavery. I don't want to go over the, is there half pregnancy? Come on. Slavery is a condition of unfreedom, period. Whatever you call that. You can't think for yourself, do for yourself. You don't have command of your own existence. Somebody else does. And so that kind of reality goes back to time immemorial. There's always been some form of exploitation of human beings by other human beings that's still going on, not to the extent that it has been. There are still forms of enslavement of other populations. And incidentally, most of the slaves in the history of the world, the experts say, I'm not one of them, most slaves were women.